Jennifer and I, over the years, have developed well over 150 tools in our toolbox. And we obviously use other people's material, especially close friends that we trust. Today, we're going to talk about something that every single one of us can relate to, which is communication. How many of you have been in a conversation and walked away and wondered if anything at all landed that you said? Most of us have experienced that. And so what we've tried to do with our clients, and again, I think the beauty of this work that we do is we happen to be in the wealth, next gen of wealth, influence space, but all of this works for Eric and Jennifer Garcia and our family. And what we created were the 3 keys to communication, or keys to communication as we call them. And the first one is to be direct. The second one is to be truthful. And the third one is to be respectful. Now, I don't know what instantly hits you when you hear those 3 categories as a challenge point, but in our work, and certainly within our family, being respectful actually ends up being the biggest challenge. And so what we try to do with our families is we try to get them to define these tools before we unpack them. So we want to know, what does direct communication look like to you? What does being truthful look like to you, even when it might hurt? And then what does it mean to really be respectful? And so I'm just going to unpack these real quick and break them down. The direct piece, what's so important about leading out with being direct is when you're direct, there's very little margin of error on being understood. When you beat around the bush, so if we're driving from here to LA and we go through Flagstaff, there's a big margin of error compared to running right up to 10 and cutting straight across on the 10 and heading over, right? So we want the most direct path for somebody to communicate a point to somebody, because there's less interpretation that needs to be done. So being direct clears out the cobwebs and typically or normally allows things to be understood. And often we say in the most simplest way. So it's direct and it's simple. Great combination as a baseline to launch into communication. The second one then is truthful. Not partially truthful, not 50% truthful, but just being honest. When you are honest and you're direct, those two together, very little margin for error. And what happens is we think, well, if we are truthful with somebody, we're going to hurt their feelings. Or if we're truthful with somebody, they're not going to like me anymore. But actually, just the opposite works. That when you're known as being truthful, i.e. you're being honest with somebody, you're like a magnet to them, because you don't get that in the culture very much. So being direct, which means you're being straight up and simple, and on top of that, being truthful and or honest, are just a great combination. Then you add the third, which is respectful. And the reason why we say typically this is one of the biggest challenges in our family work is because who knows you better than family? I mean, if you're married, who knows you better than your wife? If you're married and have kids, your wife and your kids know you better than anybody else, typically. And the respectful piece can go right out the window in a nanosecond. Why? Because you're most comfortable with these people. So you feel like your tone of voice can be whatever, your body language can be whatever. And what happens is, though, is when there isn't respect, you can be as direct as you want and you can be as truthful as you want. But if you're not respectful, it all washes down the river. And so our challenge to our clients is try not to bring all the baggage of all your years of either being married or being a parent or being a sibling into your communication, because the moment you bring all that with you, being direct, be truthful, and being respectful goes right out the window. And again, in our work, typically, it's the respect piece that tends to be the most lost. And all we can figure is that when you've got a history with somebody, that history allows you to reposition the way you communicate. And you don't feel like you need to be respectful to them because they're just your brother, or they're just your sister, or they're just mom, dad, or husband, wife. Actually, respect is what we say holds the other two together. And so, keys to communication: be truthful, be respectful, and baseline that with being direct from the very beginning. And so then let me just share a quick story. So we're in a meeting with a family, and it was a 2-day meeting, and there was the troubled child that everybody identifies. And what actually happened then in the meeting is everybody did a great job of being direct as we were dealing with this family issue. No problem being truthful, but boy, did the respectful piece come out. So with one of the guy's siblings, she just would drop the hammer on the conversation every time she opened her mouth. And what we had to do is simply go back to this tool and say, listen, we all agreed that we were going to be direct, we were going to be truthful, and be respectful. But you have chose not to be respectful. And because it's happened over and over again, and we've warned you over and over again, we're going to have to ask you to leave the room and leave the meeting. And you're probably not going to be invited back. You could have heard a pin drop in that room, and here's why. This one person that was being disrespectful had trampled on the family for years. And they didn't have a structure to govern that. Thus, nobody in the family, including the parents, were willing to step in and call it out. So by having these guidelines in your family, in your business, in your personal life, it helps govern you, and it helps set the tone for people you're working with. So keys to communication: be direct, be truthful, be respectful, and be most cautious around the respectful piece, knowing that simply your tone of voice or your body language can blow the respectful piece right out of the water.